Good afternoon and welcome to our TV show featuring documentaries revealing the realities behind myths using research and scholarship. I'm your host, Ergün Kırlıkovalı, and I will be with you every Sunday at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. You're welcome to send me your feedback at myth&realities.com. I have demonstrated in episode 33, thanks to Dr. Heath Lowry's meticulous research, how Armenian writers use only those sources that support their allegations and ignore all others. Hovannisian and Hovsepian keep recycling pretty much same selective sources to arrive at same partisan and erroneous conclusions. I will continue with Dr. Heath Lowry's research findings involving American, British, and Austrian eyewitnesses and American archives. As to the source of the fire which ultimately destroyed Izmir, page 5 informs us that it was on Wednesday, September 13th, that Grescovich himself found evidence of incendiarism. He told me that early that morning he had seen 2 Armenian priests escorting several thousand men, women, and children from the Armenian school and Dominican churches where they had taken refuge down to the quays. When he presently went into these institutions, he found petroleum-soaked refuse ready for torch, unquote. Also on page 5, it is noted that Grescovich himself stated that his own firemen, as well as Turkish guards, had shot down many Armenian young men disguised either as women or as Turkish irregular soldiers who were caught setting fires during Tuesday night, September 12th, and September 13th in the morning, unquote. On page 6, Grescovich described Turkish response to the fires in the following terms, as reported by Prentiss, I quote, "Shortly after noon, Wednesday, September the 13th, Grescovich, convinced that Izmir was doomed, again went to the military authorities to ask for help. And again, it was not forthcoming. It was not until 6 o'clock in the evening that he was given a company of 100 soldiers to serve under his direction, and it was 8 o'clock at night before soldiers began the destruction of buildings by bombs in order to check the spread of the fire," unquote. Also on page 6, regarding Grescovich's veracity, Prentiss states that Grescovich impressed him as a thoroughly reliable witness. In support of his assessment, Prentiss provides the following account of the nature of his discussions with Grescovich. I quote, "It was not until 3 days later, that is Saturday, September 16th, that I saw Grescovich again. He told me he had no sleep for 5 days and nights, and he looked the part. Not only was he physically exhausted, but his emotions had been so wrought up by the sights he had seen that he begged to be excused from talking over details. Realizing, however, that this was the time to get to the truth, I pressed him for information and went over in chronological order of history of the fire. On that, and on several succeeding days, we explored greater part of the burned area of Izmir, and I made notes of the most important things he told me. Later, when Lloyd's men came to ascertain the extent of the damages, he refused to make any statements at all," unquote. Regardless of whether or not one credits the testimony of Grescovich, the individual charged with fighting the fire, no serious discussion of the burning of Izmir is possible without taking his account under consideration. As a case in point, we may cite Hovsepian's one example of an American eyewitness who claimed to to observe Turkish soldiers lighting fires in Izmir. Her source is the American Vice-Consul Maynard Barnes, who, she states on page 155, I quote, had seen the Turkish soldiers pouring gasoline liberally along the street in front of the consulate, was meanwhile working feverishly to save the consular records, unquote. Barnes's account, the most frequently cited source of official Turkish complicity in the fire, appears somewhat differently in the official American account that was compiled by Hepburn. There, in describing the events of Thursday evening, September 14th, the following description is given on page 33, unquote. Quote, "The fire continued to burn throughout the night, though considerably diminished. Several separate fires were observed to start in locations distant from the general conflagration, plainly indicating incendiarism. The passport office, located upon the north pier of the inner harbor, burned after midnight with many heavy explosions, probably caused by gasoline, as a number of drums had been observed in and near this building a day or two previously. This building was only a few hundred yards from the Litchfields anchorage, and the actions of the person that fired it were plainly observed by Vice-Consul Barnes from the forecastle, although the distance was too great to allow any sort of identification. A number of Turkish troops were stationed at the inshore end of the building at the time," unquote. Leaving aside the major discrepancies between Hovsepian's version and that found in the Hepburn report, and recalling Grescovich's account of attempts to halt the spread of the fire, it is clear that from 6 o'clock on the evening of Wednesday, September the 13th forward, a company of 100 Turkish soldiers, under his orders, were destroying buildings by bombs in an attempt to check the spread of the fire, as can be read on pages 5 and 6. In other words, any description of uniformed Turkish soldiers lighting fires in the city, which occurs after 6 p.m. on Wednesday, the 13th of September, may be assumed to be part of the firefighting rather than incendiary attempts. Vice-Consul Barnes offered his assessment of the fire and its causes in another document preserved in the Bristol Papers. As in the case of Prentiss' report, Hovsepian conveniently and selectively managed to ignore Barnes' conclusions. I quote, "American press accounts of the Smyrna irregularities arriving here contain gross exaggerations and untruths. Impossible to say definitely number of Greeks and Armenians killed, perhaps 2,000. Atrocities committed in the interior by Greeks and Armenians outstrip those committed by the Turks in Smyrna in savagery and wanton destruction. Majority of the Americans here believe Smyrna fires fired by Armenians," unquote. This information can be found at the Library of Congress, Bristol Papers, Subject Files, Container number 75, folder on Commissioner Messages Received 1922, and Inquiry 1919. Barnes' dispatch is dated October 9, 1922, and was sent from the USS Etzel by radio. Hovsepian's failure to deal with the testimony of Fire Chief Grescovich also raises serious questions with regard to her attempts on pages 142 and 44 to use the testimony of the two of city's Greek firemen vis-a-vis Turkish culpability. Specifically, her reliance on pages 144 and 235 on the accounts of a Sergeant Çorbacıs and fireman Emanuel Katsoros two Greeks, as preserved in the transcript of a London trial in 1924, suffers from her failure to rebut Grescovich's statement that following the arrival of the Turkish authorities on September 9, 1922, he had, unquote, applied for additional men and firefighting equipment. Instead of helping him, the Turkish military governor, learning that there were still 12 Greeks in the fire department, ordered their immediate arrest, which left the department with only 37 men. From September 10th to September 12th, so many fires were reported at such widely separated points that the fire department was absolutely unable to deal with them. They were extinguished by Turkish soldiers, unquote. The trial in question was held at the Royal Courts of Justice, King's Bench Division, Commercial List, London, on December 2nd, 1924. It was a lawsuit brought by the American Tobacco Company, Inc., versus Guardian Assurance Company, Limited. Hovsepian used a copy of the transcript preserved in the Bristol Papers, U.S. Library of Congress. The statement on page 142, must be reconciled with Sergeant Chorbaji's claim that he was fighting fire on September 12th and September 13th. If, as Grescovich states, Chorbaji's and his 11 fellow Greek members of the department were under arrest, his account of the following incident on September 13th is highly questionable. Quote, "These fires were barely under control when an alarm came from the Armenian church several streets away. Leaving some firemen at the church, Chorbajis hurried on alone towards some flames on Chukur Street. I climbed to the roof and found bedding on fire," he testified later. "Then I went down into one of the rooms and I saw a Turkish soldier well armed. He was setting fire to the interior of a drawer. He looked rather fiercely at me when he saw me, but he left. I caught the strong smell of petroleum," unquote. By selectively ignoring the contemporary eyewitness testimony of the fire chief Grescovich and totally endorsing that of Chorbajis, delivered 2 years after the event, Hovsepian raises serious doubts as to her historical methodology. As even these few examples establish, Hovsepian's highly selective utilization of material preserved in the U.S. National Archives and the Library of Congress casts serious doubt upon her contention that the Turkish military were the perpetrators of the conflagration which destroyed the city of Izmir on September 13th through 15th, 1922. Her study, while well written, adds up to very poor history, i.e., she has produced a work of polemic rather than one based on sound historical scholarship. What is important here, however, is not the quality of Hovsepian's scholarship, but rather the fact that the testimonies preserved in the U.S. National Archives and Bristol Papers in the Library of Congress are, to say the least, conflicting. Based on a selective utilization of their contents, each of the following conclusions may be reached. A. The Izmir fire was deliberately set by Armenian population of Izmir. B. The Izmir fire was deliberately set by Greek inhabitants of Izmir. C. The Izmir fire was deliberately set by the Turkish army. D. The Izmir fire was an accident stemming from the looting of Turkish irregular troops. Given the diversity of the interpretations, it is possible to draw from the wide variety of testimonies preserved in the American accounts, as well as those in British, French, and Italian sources. The actual cause and origin of the Izmir fires may never be determined on the basis of this material alone. One key missing element is obviously the records of the Turkish military authorities, nominally in control of the city throughout the period in question. Turkish forces entered Izmir on September 9, 1922. History can serve as a guide only to the extent that each generation is willing to benefit from the lessons it preserves. Between 1915 and 1980, that is, 65 years, Turkey sat quietly by as the history of the Turco-Armenian relations during World War I was being written, or rather butchered, by Armenians and their Orientalist supporters with access to Western archives. For such efforts to have any success in influencing Western public opinion, which has fed many decades of Armenian accounts alone defaming the Turks, the Ottoman archives covering the First World War must be studied by all qualified scholars, Turkish and non-Turkish alike. The burning of Izmir is only the final page in the struggle of Turks to establish their own national state out of the remnants of the Ottoman Empire. Not surprisingly, the only book-length study dealing with its destruction is written by an Armenian on the basis of carefully vetted American accounts. The Smyrna affair will continue to be the only study dealing with this event until and unless the Turkish scholars unlock the Turkish contents of the archives with research and open the doors to honest history. Honest history. Only then will we have the possibility to more fully comprehend the chronology of events which resulted in the destruction of Izmir in September 1922. The clearest chronology of what occurred in the following days is preserved in Hepburn, Smyrna Disaster, pages 1 through 48. He provides the following detail on the actual sequence of the fire. Saturday, September 9th, 1922, at 11:30 a.m., the first Turkish cavalry forces entered the central city, page 7. The senior Turkish officer was Mürsel Pasha, page 8. Sunday, September 10th, reports of isolated incidents of sniping and looting, page 10 through 12. Mürsel Pasha is replaced by Nurettin Pasha, page 12. Looting and scattered killings are reported, page 13. Monday, September 11th, 1922, American relief officials established first personal contact with Nurettin Pasha, page 14 through 20. Tuesday, September 12th, meeting with the military commander Kasım Pasha, page 21. Plans for evacuation of naturalized American citizens, page 23. Tuesday, September 12th, U.S. Consul General Horton sails from Izmir for Piraeus with naturalized Americans, page 24. Report of a fire, a house burning in the Armenian quarter in the forenoon, page 25, 2 p.m. Reports of 3 fires burning around the compound of the Intercollegiate Institute, page 25. At approximately 9 p.m., Hepburn reports, I quote, the wind had been steadily increasing since the sunset and was now blowing fresh on the port quarter, unquote, page 28. From the point to the passport office, a distance of about a mile, the broad waterfront streets appeared to be one solidly packed mass of humanity, domestic animals, vehicles, and luggage. Beyond, still separated from the crowd by a few short unburned blocks, the city was mass of flame, driving directly down upon the waterfront by a still breeze. Page 29. Thursday, September 14th. The fire continued to burn fiercely all day. It had reached the waterfront about 1:30 a.m. at a point near the open square just south of the Smyrna Theater, It did not immediately spread along the waterfront from this point, but during the course of the day worked slowly in from the rear at several points, both north and south of its original outbreak on the quay. Page 31. Friday, September 15th, 1922. The fire burned itself out during the night to such an extent that in the morning, the situations could no longer be regarded as one of imminent personal danger for the refugees on the shore. Page 33. Hepburn visits Kazım Pasha, who, with a dramatic gesture, he answered my expression of condolence with, "We have lost the war." Neither he nor Vali gave any evidence of having heard of any rumor as to Turkish responsibility for the disaster. Page 35. Saturday, September 15th. No more reference to fire. This letter by Prentiss to Bristol, dated January 11th, 1923, housed in the Library of Congress, Bristol Papers collection, General Correspondence, container number 38, is quite revealing. Dear Admiral Bristol, these stories will be published in a syndicate of about 100 of the greatest newspapers in America. It occurs to me that you might be interested in seeing them. I am, therefore, enclosing the advance copies of the manuscript. With renewed assurances of my kindest personal regards, I am, sincerely, Mark O. Prentiss. Smyrna Fire. For release not before January 16th, the hitherto untold story of the Smyrna Fire told by Mark O. Prentiss, American representative of the Near East Relief. Armenians and Greeks, not Turks, set the fire. Evidence of fire chief revealed. Copyright 1923 by North American Newspaper Alliance in the United States, Canada, Great Britain, and South America. All rights reserved. By Mark O. Prentiss. It is a lengthy letter, but I will quote one paragraph that pretty much sets the tone. I quote, "Nearly everybody in America, it appears, is convinced that the Turks were responsible for the fire which added the final touches of tragedy to the Smyrna horror. The unanimity and firmness of this conviction surprised me at first, as I believed it would have surprised anybody else of whatever nationality or political allegiance who had recently come from the scene of the disaster. The motive, usually considered of supreme importance in crimes of this sort, does not clearly point to the Turks. They had captured Smyrna. The city, as it stood, was one of the greatest prizes ever taken in Oriental warfare. The Turks had unquestioned title to its foods, its commodities of all sorts, its houses. It was a storehouse of supplies most urgently needed for its peoples and armies. Why destroy it?" Unquote. Will the information presented today help the Armenian diaspora see the plain truth? Will the Armenian diaspora finally accept the Turkish-American offer of civilized dialogue and reasoned discourse? Please join me next week to find out. Thank you, and see you next week when I conclude on the subject of Izmir fires.